All right. Hello and welcome to STL History Live. My name is Aaron Pelker, and I am a community engagement coordinator with the Missouri History Museum's Public History Department. And I want to thank you for spending part of your Wednesday evening with us, or Thursday night with us. Before we get to our presentation, I do have a couple of remarks. I want to mention that all three Missouri Historical Society locations are open to the public from Wednesday through Sunday. Your safety is a top priority, and we would love for you to visit if you feel comfortable doing so. Advanced free reservations are required to visit all our locations, but please visit mohistory.org to plan your visit and reserve your free tickets. Next, I want to mention that tonight's program is presented in conjunction with the museum's Mighty Mississippi exhibit. That exhibit's only with us for a few months, ending its run at the Missouri History Museum on June 6th. So be sure to reserve your free tickets to see that exhibit. Tonight's program is also part of a statewide effort to honor our state's, Missouri's bicentennial. I'll drop a link in tonight's chat for more information about bicentennial related programming, so please look out for that. I also want to thank our museum members and the Zoo Museum Tax District for their generous support for both our exhibits and our programming. We wouldn't be able to host programs like tonight's without their contributions. Lastly, before we get to tonight's program, I do want to explain a few of the features you'll find on Zoom that may be helpful this evening. First, this will be about a 40-minute presentation with about 10 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. You can submit your questions for our speaker through the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. I also want to make sure everyone's aware of our accessibility features. Automatic transcription is available for this program. You can access the transcript by either clicking the arrow next to the closed caption button, which is located on that same Zoom toolbar, and then you can choose how you want those captions to appear. Or you can click on the red live on otter.ai live notes icon in the upper left-hand corner of your screen to select view stream on otter.ai live. And that'll bring up a transcript in a separate browser window. At the conclusion of our program, we hope you'll complete a short survey that will open automatically in your internet browser. We appreciate and look forward to your feedback. With that, I do want to turn it over to my collaborator on this evening's program, Amy Clark of the St. Louis chapter of the Mound City Archaeological Society, to introduce this evening's speakers. Thanks and enjoy.
Hi, thanks, Aaron. My name is Amy Clark. I'm the president of the Mound City Archaeological Society, the St. Louis chapter of the Missouri Archaeological Society. Both organizations promote the study, investigation, and interpretation of archaeological sites and remains. During non-pandemic times, Mound City holds a monthly lecture at the Missouri History Museum. Tonight is our first virtual program, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker. Timothy R. Pauketat is director of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, the Illinois State Archaeologist, senior research scientist with the Prairie Research Institute, and professor of anthropology and medieval studies at the University of Illinois. Professor Pauketat has published extensively on his research at Cahokia and other Mississippian sites, and has written or edited 16 books, including The Archaeology of Ancient North America, New Materialisms, Ancient Urbanisms, Chiefdoms and Other Archaeological Delusions, and Cahokia, Ancient America's Great City. His latest book project is tentatively entitled The Cult of the Thunderers, from which he draws tonight. Tim has been the invited speaker for lectures and conferences throughout the United States and internationally, and has served as a consultant for the PBS series Native America, as well as stories by NPR, BBC News, and both Archaeology and American Archaeology magazines. His most recent thoughts have turned toward understanding ancient climate change as a window into the future. Tonight, Tim will present The Sacred Mississippi and the Wind That Brings Rain, Travel, People, and Climate Change a Millennium Ago. Please welcome Tim Pauketat.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you also, Aaron, both of them responsible for getting me here tonight. Let me also thank the Missouri Historical Society, the Missouri History Museum, and the Mound City Archaeological Society for hosting this. I told Amy and Aaron that I do Zoom all day long, but this is actually my first Zoom presentation. I've been avoiding them up to this point. So hopefully, because I tend to gesticulate a lot and I like to move around, and I can't do that so well in front of a laptop, but hopefully this will work fine. What you're going to hear tonight is a light version of a chapter of pre-Columbian America's big history, right? And because I think there are bigger relationships than are often talked about that encompass Mississippi Valley, the Southwest, and Mesoamerica. Some of this, especially the second part, will be a little conjectural. And that's as I mean it to be, because I think conjecture is the beginning of pursuit of knowledge that leads ultimately to a bit better understanding of the world. This also will be focused a lot on Cahokia and environs. I bet a lot of the listeners already have some familiarity with that. Yeah, there will be some new parts, I think, that you won't be so familiar with. And I want to say at the outset that a big history like this is really only possible as a group effort, a project. And I'm drawing on the last 10 years of collaborations and other contributions by a whole series of folks, indigenous, non-indigenous researchers and stakeholders. And I'm going to list those at the end of this talk. However, I do want to single out 3 people who are close collaborators and principal investigators that a lot of this would be impossible without. That includes Dr. Susan Alt, Indiana University, Dr. Thomas Emerson, former director of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, and Chief Archaeologist Jeff Cruckton of the Illinois State Historic Preservation Office. I also want to acknowledge Native American descendants of Cahokia and Cahokia-related heirs by recognizing the water protectors, part of a movement that emerged from the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, 2017, who include Cahokian descendants. Their cause, their sensibilities about water inform this talk, and also I think should inform our larger collective approach to water and climate change going forward, because water really isn't just something that is sold in water bottles, nor are rivers just transportation corridors. In fact, many people actually still live an intimate bodily and spiritual relationship to water in all of its forms: gas, liquid, solid. Certainly in the past, as I think you'll see, water was imbued with spiritual power and healing properties that could be experienced by people at springs, on rivers, inside steam baths, and more. And that's the lesson, I think, of the water protectors. And that's also the lesson of Cahokia and the Mississippi. There was and is a different way than we're used to of relating to water and climate that affected history. And the history that I want to talk about begins here. Again, some of you will have experience with Cahokia or knowledge of Cahokia. This is, I think, the best mural now of Cahokia because it gets at the properties of the place that made it powerful. It was built in and around with respect to water, as you'll see in just a minute, and also the atmospheric conditions, the winds that brought rain, because of the importance of corn, which I'll get back to. A couple of things I want you to notice in this slide that will go throughout this talk is that the artist Herb Rowe did a really nice job of recognizing the importance of circular pyramids. You'll see one in the foreground on the left, flat top circular pyramids with circular buildings on top. Those are really critical. In fact, of the region's 200 earthen platforms, about 50 of them were circular platforms. So there's something there that a lot of people haven't thought about. And then you'll also notice in this mural going all the way back to the lightning, and then just to the right of the lightning, posts or poles. Poles are like one of the founding big poles, or one of the founding elements of the city of Cahokia. The city of Cahokia really is, the urban version of it anyway, is founded in some kind of short-term moment around the middle of the 11th century AD, about 1050, when a whole series of new attributes are brought into the region and built into the city, actually into one of three large precincts. This is the largest. This is what we call the Cahokia site today. And then it is immediately thousands of people poured in to take part and to live at this place. So thousands meaning 15, 20,000 people spread across these three urban precincts, we now think, with tens of thousands more, 20, 30,000 living in the farmlands all around this urban core. All right. Now those posts, there were posts by, in villages of people who lived before the urban experiment of Cahokia, but nothing like what you see here. This is the base of a large cypress pole. They don't grow in this region now. They may never have grown as far north as St. Louis. We're not entirely sure. They grow down near Thebes Gap and south today. Cahokians possibly, well, even if they got them locally, they cut them and hauled them in as one of the founding moments of this city. They emplaced a lot of these as vertical, sometimes called marker posts, all around the city. There were the cypress ones, there were pine from the St. Francis Mountains, and then there was also cedar, all of which are these aromatic trees, all of which probably were understood to be imbued with special properties. Certainly cypress is a tree that grows in water. You have to cut it down, haul it through water, and get it to the place that you want to move it. And then lastly, the important thing about these that you'll see later why I think is really important is they aren't left to rot in place. Now this one may be an exception, but mostly they are put in the ground for some purpose, maybe a ceremonial event, maybe a season, and they're pulled out again, kept somewhere, and then re in place at some point later. So there are hundreds of post pits originally excavated by the builders of Cahokia, kind of like you see this archaeologist excavating out this stump. And then the second thing that I already mentioned is the importance of circular flat top platforms. Here in the original city of St. Louis, which is a Cahokian precinct, you see 4 of them facing the river. The great indigenous archaeologist, Robert Hall, the late Robert Hall, recognized these as important and thought that there was a connection with water. They overlook water typically. And they are surmounted by circular buildings. Sometimes, and we know in one case, a post as well. The more we have researched sites that haven't really seen much work up to the 20 teens, such as the Emerald Acropolis that you're having a bird's eye view of here, the more we realize and appreciate these circular platform mounds. Here you see 10 of them, probably there were 11. And they're on a 10 meter, 30-foot high ridge. All around the base of this ridge are natural springs and seeps where water came out of the hill. And so these circular platforms are overlooking those seeps, again, that water association. This particular site where Dr. Alt and I and Jeff Cruckton and other students have excavated for 5 years up to 2018 is a particularly unusual part, and it also founded at about the same time as the city of Cahokia. That water association, if you go to Cahokia at the right time of the year, you can see it. And here's one of the large circular platforms next to a borrow pit, a water-filled borrow pit, or a reservoir, if you will. And again, we know that in several cases, atop those flat-topped circular platforms were special circular buildings. These are like very fancy sweat lodges or steam baths. And you'll notice in a couple that you can see here, hearths inside that would have been for holding hot rocks, for water to be poured over, for steam to be created. The interesting thing about these, again, is like those circular platforms, like Cahokia in general, these have no precedent until they arrive at 1050. So they seem to be introduced from somewhere and built into the city at its very foundations. In fact, they form part of a series of political, religious buildings that comprise elements of Cahokian neighborhoods. Here you can see a module, if you will, of the special religious and political buildings, the house at the very top having been rebuilt a number of times, probably an actual house of the priest or member of the elite taking care of the rest of these buildings. And those, when you project what those look like, because what you just saw was the floor plans, we think they would have looked something like this, right? With a big temple-like structures in the background there, that one also having a really important central pole, under which was discovered and left in place a female sacrifice, as is the case with other poles in post pits in the greater Cahokia region. This complex was excavated at the Emerald site. So then those modules, which comprise parts of neighborhoods, are then arrayed around the precincts of greater Cahokia. Again, there are 3 big ones and a series of smaller outliers, such as the one you're looking down on here, a LiDAR image of central Cahokia itself. There are a series of, like neighborhoods all around this that obviously you can't see, but they're also built with respect to water. So what we now know, thanks to the work of Sarah Byrus and Melissa Baltasik and others in the last 10 years, is that the Cahokia, the precinct Cahokia consists of a dry area where there are neighborhoods, and then earthen causeways or walkways that lead back into the watery realm, back and through what today are, bullfrog laden or infested swampy areas that are teeming with life and sounds, and also are the locations where the important Cahokian dead were placed through this realm, this watery realm at the end of these yellow causeways. There may be more causeways. We're just really figuring this out now. Here's a short one, just so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm actually standing in front of a circular platform, and this is common also, and looking down across a very short causeway to a rectangular platform that you really can't see so well, which is sticking out into a borrow pit filled with water or a reservoir. So this is another common pattern. These causeways link those all-important circular platform mounds with those circular steam baths or circular water temples with some other kind of performance space, be it a mortuary mound or a platform, a rectangular platform like this. It's become increasingly clear to those of us working on this problem, the people that I'll list later, that Cahokia really was a water city. And you see it in representations, and representational art, and in one case, a map. So here's a female figurine, probably a goddess, who's pouring something, I would guess water, out of a conch shell dipper, a marine shell imported from the Gulf of Mexico, obviously referencing water. Here is downriver a bit, at the site where Cahokians went to get the raw material orthoquartzite to make chunky stones, which I won't explain, but is a map, or what sure seems to be a map. Terry Norris in the foreground, and then you see this plan view of this map, which is a serpentine-like rendition of the Mississippi River with dots that may be places and occasionally a place glyph near one of the dots that may be indicating who resided at that particular place. This seems to be from about Thebes Gap, showing an area from about Thebes Gap down to the confluence with the Ohio River. Giving you some sense that the Mississippi is a special river with special attributes. Importantly, and going back to my original note about rivers not just being transportation corridors, there is really very little evidence of trade at this time. The way we think of trade as I give you this, you give me that, I'm happy, I go home. Instead, people get on the Mississippi to go obtain special materials, probably with special powers or associated with supernatural beings. Marine shell is the Cahokians' material of choice. This is what they get more of than really anything else from far off land, the Gulf of Mexico. That's a long trip, and they bring it back and they make objects out of it that some cases, like the human head earpieces that you see here, reference supernatural beings. Robert Hall thought these were probably water spirits. You wore one on each ear if you were important. He also thought, and a lot of us would agree, that these are Mesoamerican objects, a local version of Mesoamerican style object, these earpieces that are worn on the ears, depicting a very Mesoamerican-like water spirit. The Aztec called them Tlaloc, Mayas called them Chalk, twisted noses, goggle eyes. The water symbolism appears in other materials. You see the pot to the right. Today still, descendants identify the spirals and the other diagonal lines as water and wind symbols. That pot was probably used to boil water into which you put the leaves of an exotic plant, the Yaupon holly, which grows no farther north than Arkansas. And then those cups on the lower left are used to drink this caffeinated beverage as part of ritual gatherings. In fact, the Kisi figure here that you see in the upper left is a Cahokian carving showing you a Cahokian with a mug in his hand, probably getting ready to drink out of that vat that's in front of him. A lot of what you've been seeing, again, is installed or emplaced at around 1050 with the very foundation of this urban complex of Cahokia. One of those things that we now see at 1050 also, for the first time, are what most people would think of as the faces of, especially this upper row, the faces of thunderers or falcon men or birdmen. Maybe you can think of these as the human version of thunderbirds come to earth, and these are sketches that are drawn on pots at ritual events, perhaps to invoke the spirit of the thunderer, which is also a thunderer is basically the wind god that brings rain, right? A later version of the falconoid or the birdman heads is seen below. Important on this particular Cahokian carving is the fact that this central linear motif on both sides, there are woodpeckers on one side and human heads on the other side, is a pole motif, a striped pole motif that likely, as you'll see, is probably depicting a rope, either a rope itself or a rope wrapped around one of those wooden ceremonial poles. Another item that comes in at 1050, potentially associated with thunderers, is this knife. These beautifully made big knives that would have been held in the hand and used for, we're not quite sure unless you go to Mesoamerica. And in Mesoamerica, these are sacrificial knives. In fact, these are maybe one of the most intriguing new additions to Cahokia that you almost have to say, like, "Oh, somebody copied those from Mesoamerica." So the one you see on the right is a Cahokian dagger. The one you see on the left is an Aztec dagger. They're the same size, same shape. It's almost as if maybe they're in the same, napped in the same way, but the Cahokian one is made with Southern Illinois chert. The Aztec one is obviously made in Mesoamerica. It becomes really intriguing once we start appreciating that we know the Cahokians are out traveling long distances on the Mississippi. 10 years ago, my colleagues and I started a project up at Trempealeau, Wisconsin, which you're looking at the Minnesota side of this beautiful, rugged landscape. And the Cahokians, we found evidence of the Cahokians, their Cahokian pots, their Cahokian artifacts, their Cahokian buildings that you see on the left, and their Cahokian platform mounds with causeways at Trempealeau, Wisconsin. In fact, we even think we have a circular steam bath found in geophysics. They're not up there, it now seems, to meet other people. They're up there to occupy this rugged, unique landscape, which includes a mountain sticking in the middle of the river, which is covered in earlier woodland burial mounds, to commune with the spirits of the place, not with the human beings, it seems. Again, travel on the river for a spiritual journey. We also now know, in the subject of grad student Caitlin Antonook's dissertation, that the same thing happened to the south. So here in northwestern Mississippi is another Cahokian occupation of what becomes a very large later Mississippian site, but initially it consists of Cahokian pots, Cahokian artifacts, and these little Cahokian pit houses, which you're seeing, which you see off to the right. We're not sure why they're here yet, but one could assume that they're there not to greet people, but they're there to occupy an important, powerful landscape. And so here those sites are. There's Trempealeau in the north, you see Cahokia in the middle, you see Carson in northwestern Mississippi downriver. The blue dots are other sites with clear Cahokian occupations like this, and there are more. The red dots are Caddoan sites of people who speak a very different language than probably was spoken along Mississippi, where there is some evidence or reason to think that there are Cahokian ties. And then the open dots are other sites. You see the Thebes Gap rock art. You see way down in the Gulf of Mexico, Dauphine Island, which is the southernmost point where a Cahokian figurine has been found. Raleigh Island, where there's a contemporary shell bead making site, making things in the kind of a Cahokian style. And then all the red words are things that clearly Cahokians were interested in obtaining. Again, not through trade, but seemingly direct acquisition. Now, if they're traveling that far and Cahokians appears with this burst, we have to step back just a little and try to understand this in a more of a global perspective. What's going on that leads up to Cahokia and that may help explain these things that appear at Cahokia that seem a little Mesoamerican? The medieval warm period is something that's seemingly mostly restricted to the north. It sees about, on average, a centimeter, a degree temperature rise in many places, not every place. Some places get colder. Some places, the Maya region, for instance, get warmer but drier. The Mississippi Valley gets warmer and wetter. And so in the Mississippi Valley, starting around 900, because of these warmer, wetter changes in climate, you have the perfect conditions for the adoption of maize. Maize, up to this point, we now think, based on studies by Tom Emerson and Mary Simon and Chris Hedman, wasn't around the Mississippi Valley before a fairly abrupt adoption around 900. People probably knew about it, they weren't growing it. Maize, of course, is going to only exacerbate the kind of climatic conditions that may be encouraging people to congregate in this part of the Mississippi Valley, because maize is an extraordinarily water sensitive plant needs the water at the right time. Also to cook maize correctly, you really need to process it with lye. In this American bottom region around Cahokia, that means limestone. And people start quarrying limestone and probably positioning their settlements with respect to advantageous access to farmland and limestone. Now, while that's going on, things are not going well in all parts of Mesoamerica. This is the beginning of the Maya collapse, when these big centers, these cities like Tikal here, are undergoing political problems. And instead, during this terminal classic period, you probably didn't expect to hear about the Maya in this talk, but here we go. People are abandoning the cities, and they are adhering to, or buying into new religions that have a lot to do with frequenting watery places like this cenote, this sinkhole that you see here, a circular water pool where people go and they build temples to the water gods, which are basically steam baths, circular or somewhat circular subterranean buildings with rounded domes. And this is happening 800s into the 900s, at the same time that people are abandoning the Maya cities and they're moving to the coasts. In fact, when they move to the coast, they become more maritime oriented. And as you'll see, there's reason to think that they are also migrating in interesting directions. In other parts of Mesoamerica, circular platforms, like here in West Mexico, which are built to the wind that brings rain god, which is also associated with thunder and birds, is spreading across central Mexico and up into what it's described as the Huastec region. These mounds, in fact, are bases for poles, and those poles have flyers or birdmen who climb them and then fly on top as part of this ritual. So the interesting convergence here that seems to be happening is that the medieval warm period is encouraging dramatic changes among the Maya. In fact, the latest linguistic reconstructions have some segment of the Maya population moving up the coast just south of Tamaulipas and Texas into the Huastec region. This is also where people are moving, seemingly, who practice that pole ritual. So you have Maya with their water steam baths, and you have other people with their pole rituals coming in and occupying a land that's still pretty well watered. Interestingly, this is around 900. 900 is when corn is adopted both at Cahokia and in the Caddo area. In the Caddo area, they also, at 900, start building flat-top circular platform mounds. In fact, in Wasteka, it's flat-topped circular platform mounds with circular buildings on top that are built with wall trenches, a lot like the things that we see at Cahokia 150 years later. So here's one of these Wasteken platform mounds. It's an earthen mound plastered over. There were like 12 or 15 of these at this particular site right on the coast. These are later among the Aztec are the same temples that are made to the wind that brings rain god. This is Ehekak Quetzalcoatl, for those of you interested in Mesoamerican names. We think that that's the god that has become prominent in Huasteca and as in this merger of Maya and non-Maya circular building and pole ceremonialism. Really interestingly, that pole ceremonialism continues in that Huastec region and across other parts of Mexico into the 1500s, in fact, into today. So here you see a version of a pole climbing ritual. They put a pole up to climb as part of a harvest festival, and you can see there's a bird on top. There's another rendition of a pole ceremony, a really tall pole, big, where there's rope to facilitate the people climbing to the top. And then maybe some of you have seen this ritual. It's really spectacular. 4 men hang off the sides and slowly rotate and revolve around this post as they drop to the ground. Note that rope on the pole too. And these guys are dressed up as Birdmen. There are codices that show this very thing. This one's in central Mexico. You can see the Birdmen in a framework at the top, not quite hanging down yet. And you can see the rope that spirals around the pole. So why do we think then, given the possible coincidences, that a Cahokian pole is just a marker post? It really seems unlikely. It seems unlikely in part because even in their own depictions of these poles, again, this is kind of I duplicated these so that they look like it's one whole tablet. You can see that there is a diagonal line, sometimes called the striped pole. I would suspect these are rope motifs, if not also some indication, some wind symbolism. In fact, here's later Mississippian imagery showing basically men, maybe god men, dancing around a pole with stripes, and then these dots, which could be water symbols. Sean Lambert and others have recognized that this pole is basically this pot, except with instead of a circular pot top motif, they've stretched it out into a linear motif. And we already know that this is some kind of wind water symbolism. And so here you have a pole that, if it's not showing you ropes on pole that flyers hang from, is certainly indicating some kind of wind water symbolism, right? In vertical dimension, it looks like a pole. Horizontal dimension, the Ramey pot, the Cahokian pot on the left, shows Thunderbird motifs, sort of meant to feel like they're moving rotationally. And then, of course, the pole, the Mexican pole flyers doing the same from bird's eye view. There's even some other things to kind of play around with once you think a little bit about it. This is a Birdman from Spiro, famous image carved on shell. Some people think that it's a localized version of the wind that brings rain, a Mexican wind that brings rain god, which is also depicted as a Birdman. The interesting thing here is we like to look at it like this, but this is not the way that people would have viewed this, because you can see there's a suspension hole at the bottom. This thing would have been viewed like this. This shell would have been hung up on a string, which is interesting because, of course, that is the exact way that valadores, or these pole flyers of Mexico, Birdmen, dance in the air around these poles, upside down. And if you thought maybe there's no reason to think that such things happen in North America, all you really have to do is look at the sun dance out on the plains and realize that some Mexican version of a pole flying ceremony has been localized out on the plain as dancers dancing around the pole in a circle, tethered with ropes to the pole, looking up and either praying to or referencing in some way the thunderers. So in short, and I'm almost near the end here. In short, there's a big history here. Now, it's somewhat conjectural. We know a lot about the Mississippi Valley itself. And what we now think is that people are traveling great distances to go to places where there are special supernaturally infused features or things that are brought back because they are powerful. It's likely to me, it seems to me that given the explosion of construction to build urban Cahokia at 1050 that is accompanied by a range of new things that all are tinged with Mesoamerican flavors, you probably have not just Cahokians, but Cahokians around 1050 making trips, maybe just one trip, down into this Wasteken region. potentially staying there for a year or more, and then returning home with newfound knowledge and power. This is not an unusual thing worldwide. This is something that is seen in all early civilizations. And there's every reason, given what I told you about, at least with these things, to suspect that how else would you get an array, an assemblage of unusual, unprecedented things, all of which you see here, in a moment of time, in a moment of great climatic change, which would have impacted people who view the waters and the winds very differently than perhaps many of us do. How else to explain that? Now, it's conjectural, but what we need to do, of course, is study the histories of each one of these things. We know them somewhat. We need to know more. How were these? When did these arrive? Who made them? Same thing with posts. Were these carried up the river or not? When did these thunder faces come in, et cetera, et cetera? The problem, of course, is that to study, you have to study a landscape and sites all across one or more landscapes, almost the entire Mississippi River. And in many of the today's urban areas, you know what's happening. And this is outside St. Louis. This is 1 year, and this is a couple, 3 years later. The landscapes that we need to study are going away. No matter how good the preservation laws are, they can never be good enough. There's just too much happening. What do we do? It's the mission of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey that I direct to do archaeology at this landscape scale. Some of this is compliance work we do for the state of Illinois, the Department of Transportation, but we piece things together that we do to try to address these big questions like the kinds that I'm presenting to you here. That's still not enough. And of course, you don't necessarily want to excavate all of this material anyway. What we of course have to do is think big about preservation. Those of you around St. Louis know this, and you know the conversations that have already taken place about nationalizing Cahokia and then all these various other Cahokian sites to try to preserve them. Really isn't just the Cahokia region. It's up in Wisconsin. It's down in Mississippi. We need to think really big. There's various people who have worked on this. COVID really has kind of put a damper on this, even on our efforts at the University of Illinois. Hopefully, as we come out of COVID, come out of the dark ages that we've been in for the last few years, we will pick these efforts back up again and work together and try to save the last pieces so that we can understand the big history that seems to be telling us something about maybe the way we should be in our own future. And with that, I would like to thank you and I'll list contributors and collaborators to much of the things that I reviewed here, and also some of the funding agencies and foundations.
All right, Tim, thanks for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to go ahead and get started with a couple of questions here. David has asked, has anyone done recent dental isotope work looking for Central American or Mexican levels?
There was some work up into the 2000s by University of Illinois researchers. A lot of that's not possible or desirable, in part because tribal nations aren't interested in having that done on descendant populations. So we're all going through a period of reflection and re-examination. There may be in the future certain nations who want to work on such questions. There's certainly the potential. Some of you may know there are people with filed teeth. Filed teeth is a Cahokian trait that isn't seen hardly anywhere else in the United States until you go down into Wasteken, that Mesoamerican region on the coast. So there's potential, but we can't proceed without collaborative agreements in place.
Okay, Alice, can you please say a little more about the medieval warm period? How long did it last? I thought there was a mini ice age starting around 1400.
Yes, so the medieval warm period, sometimes called the medieval climate anomaly, as I said, is a little spotty. It doesn't do the same thing everywhere, and it's mostly in the northern hemisphere. Most people agree that by 900 it has started. Some people will push it back as early as 800. Certainly, there's some things happening climatically before 900. It reaches a peak of sorts in the 11th century, and then you see the beginnings of the end of the medieval period already in the 1200s. Series of droughts and climatic shifts away from global air masses dominating weather and more toward Pacific northwestern air masses. And so by 1300, the medieval period is over. And you are, in fact, then shifting into the next, which is the Little Ice Age. Yes, when it gets considerably colder across much of North America.
Okay, Michael has a question. Cahokia certainly had flower corn. Did it also have other varieties?
Wow, I'm the wrong person to ask a corn question. I know, yes, it had other varieties. I can't tell you much about those other varieties. So another talk by another person.
Okay, Angie, can you talk about status of preservation efforts for Cahokia, Greater Cahokia?
We made we, meaning the University of Illinois, made a push in 2017, 2018, hosting a on-campus event where we had various tribal representatives and political state, national politicians and archaeologists. That revived the efforts to move to nationalizing these various sites. What happened was that stalled a couple of times, really, for political reasons. The end of the Obama administration, and then really it just seemed unlikely that much was going to happen during the Trump administration. So things stalled, and here comes COVID, and really the wind went out of the sails. And I think what I'm trying to say now is, yeah, it's stalled now. We need to regroup. All the various folks and organizations interested in this need to coordinate efforts and reach out to national level politicians, and that's really where the game needs to go next.
Okay, time for a couple more. Carolyn has asked, were mounds built at Emerald Mounds before Cahokia started theirs in 1050?
That was one of our questions when we went out there. The answer is now no. There was an earlier pre-urban Cahokia occupation out there, and occupation meaning there were some small shrine houses or little temples, seemingly to the water, and also I didn't mention the moon. But it was with the 1050 urban expansion that seemingly Cahokians kind of invested a lot of energy in upgrading that complex and building those mounds and perfecting the lunar alignments that we've described elsewhere. So it does correspond closely with the rise and depopulation of Cahokia.
Okay, here's from an anonymous attendee. Would Cahokia's Woodhenge possibly have been used as a flyer site?
Probably less likely, because those posts aren't as large as some of the isolated posts. They are less than a foot to a foot and a half in diameter at the base. They wouldn't have been as tall, and they were surrounded by perimeter poles. It actually looks more to me like an early, very large Sundance-like structure, where there's certainly ritual dancing going on inside. There are astronomical alignments. It may even been something of a lunar calendar, given the number of posts. But probably the big pole climbing and flying rituals would have been on those bigger posts that were put in and pulled out with some rapidity.
Okay. Laura has asked, have there been any connections between Cahokia and Toltec mounds in Scott, Arkansas?
Yes. There's two things about the Toltec site on the Arkansas River near Little Rock that probably are connected to Cahokia. One, it's a little earlier than Cahokia. It's actually coeval with some of the earlier Caddo things to the southwest. The mounds there are lunar aligned, which is a typical Cahokian phenomenon. It's also a Caddo phenomenon. It's actually even a Puebloan phenomenon. So we're not quite sure how that plays into the history of the movement of lunar alignments, but that region around the Toltec site is depopulated just as Cahokia is being populated. So people have speculated with some evidence in the form of pots that some of the Toltec people, the Plum Bayou culture, moved north to Cahokia itself. And they might even have brought some of those lunar knowledge with them.
Okay, and we'll do one more question here. Water equals mosquitoes. Any idea of Cahokians' relationship with mosquitoes?
I will let you guess about mosquitoes. Certainly people worldwide have ways of dealing with mosquitoes, including rubbing oils on the body. However, there's a kind of an interesting parallel with that with frogs. So, I mean, if you go back to the back part of Cahokia in a wet season now in the summer, just full of frogs and noise of chirping and croaking frogs. To many people's ears, including Charles Dickens, who went through there in one of these wet periods, it's god awful. And he couldn't imagine why anybody would want to live there, in part because of the noise of the annoying frogs. But frogs are also, have a lot of qualities that Native Americans revered. In part, they time the lunar cycles. They are connected with water and rain. So frog noises might have been good. What I'm trying to say is, yeah, mosquitoes bug us a lot. Not everybody around the world is as bugged by mosquitoes as perhaps people with more modern sensibilities are.
Okay, and then this one, we'll end on this one because it's a great one. Good closure for the night. From Angie, what work research is next at Cahokia, Greater Cahokia?
Really, we don't need to do anything in the urban core of Cahokia, at least nothing too destructive. I mean, the place is largely preserved, but there are lots of sites, Cahokian sites outside of the preserve zone that we just don't know much about. So there are secondary sites or smaller urban precincts that we just need to know the basic history of. We also need to know, are they like Emerald, where there's more intermittent religious activity, or are they actual towns where there's permanent neighborhoods? Now, a lot can be done in the urban area that will go towards advancing the kind of questions I have about circular pyramids, for instance, or poles, just by doing geophysics. So, non-invasive, you walk over the surface of Cahokia or some of these other sites, and you look below the ground surface, and you can see, in fact, we just started doing this recently, an experiment, you can see below those circular mounds if they have a circular building on them or a big post right in the middle. And we need to know that. I mean, there's more that we could know, but that's kind of a critical one. Also, those causeways. A lot of those causeways have been identified. They've all been identified really since LIDAR, laser-borne, airborne laser scanning of the ground. You could do just prove that some of those are really causeways just with a little bit of excavation, and that would go a long way to establishing the sort of a fuller picture of this urban complex. I mean, how do they connect with water? Are all those causeways real? Or are there more? That's what I would say.
Great. Another talk.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for agreeing to give us this great presentation, and to all our Mound City members. I hope that we're going to be able to meet in person back at the History Museum when it's safe to do so. Aaron?
And I want to thank, thanks again to my collaborator, Amy Clark in Mound City, and our speaker, Dr. Timothy Pauketat. I do want to draw your attention to our regularly scheduled STL History Live programs on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m., as well as Soldiers Memorial Challenge chats on select Wednesdays at noon. You can see a couple of the upcoming programs on this slide, and you can find links for all our upcoming programs at mohistory.org or on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. So please be sure to check out that lineup. And I also, please don't forget to fill out the survey before you leave tonight and let us know what you thought about our programs. Thanks again to everyone for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time. Have a good night.
Good night. Bye.